So I structure my talk a little bit differently. I'm going to talk about what archaeology tells us about what occurs after the Pueblo Revolt, what Mike got into right at the end of his talk there. So I call this New Mexico's lost decade because there's nothing written about what's happening in New Mexico between the revolt and the reconquest. So, but to back up a half step, as I'm sure many of you realize, in many ways it could be said that the revolt starts here at Taos Pueblo when Pope comes after being arrested and whipped in the plaza at Santa Fe. He comes and installs himself in a Kiva at Taos, and it's in that Kiva that he says he has a vision of 3 spirits that speak to him, and these spirits, they say, have glowing eyes and the power to shoot lightning from their fingertips, and the spirits deliver to Pope the prophecy that he can bring about a renewed and bountiful world once again if they're able to evict the Spaniards. So it's in that Kiva at Taos that Pope hatches the plan. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the broad outlines of the revolt by now. The knotted cord. Pope takes a knotted cord as a mnemonic device to signal to the other pueblos on what day the revolt is to take place. They're supposed to untie one knot each day, and on the day they untie the last knot, everybody's to unite. That's ingenious because what Pope is really doing here is crossing the linguistic boundaries that separate the pueblos. We think of the pueblos as a unitary group, but there were 7 different mutually unintelligible languages spoken at this time in New Mexico, and so the knotted cord allows you to go between communities and to cross linguistic boundaries and to get everybody to unite. That was really Pope's genius. He took the category invented by the Spaniards. The Spaniards are the ones who called them the pueblos, mainly to differentiate them from the nomadic hunter-gatherers, the ancestors of today's Navajo and Apache peoples, and Ute peoples. And Pope takes that category of pueblo and kind of turns it on the head, uses it against the Spaniards. So, of course, as we all know, on August 10th in 1680, the Pueblos rise up in this coordinated uprising. They lay siege to Santa Fe. By the time the dust settles, 401 colonial settlers have been killed, which includes 22 Franciscan missionaries. That's about 2/3 of the Franciscan body in New Mexico at the time. And the Spaniards are expelled. They move their capital down to Ciudad Juarez, where they established a colonial capital in exile for 12 years. And so in recent years, I think all this narrative about the Pueblo Revolt, probably many people in here have heard before and are becoming quite familiar with. We hear a lot more about the Pueblo Revolt today than we did even 15 or 20 years ago, which is a great thing. But when you read standard histories of the Pueblo Revolt that are based on documents alone, what we end up hearing is you hear about the events of 1680 and the uprising, and then literally you'll turn the page and the next chapter begins with the reconquest in 1692 with de Vargas coming back. And we're left with a big gap in the middle. What happened in New Mexico when the Spaniards were gone? And so really the work that Mike and I do and that our advisor Bob Purcell does and a couple of other archaeologists who are around now are doing is trying to fill in this gap on what happened between the revolt and reconquest. And so that's what I'm going to try and show you here tonight. Before I get into the actual data that we use to tell that story, I just want to mention, as Mike mentioned in the introduction, all the work I'm going to show you here was done in collaboration with the Pueblo of Jemez. I work closely with members of the Tribal Council. These are members of the Cultural Resource Advisory Committee. And I had a staff of interns from the Pueblo. And my rock star is Marlon Magdalena here, who is now the ranger at Jemez Historical Site, which is the site of the Mission Church that Mike was just showing you there in Jemez Springs. If you haven't been, it's definitely worth a visit. And Marlon would be the one who will give you a tour there. So all the work that I'm going to show you was performed in collaboration with Jemez, and everything I'm going to show you today was we got all this information through non-invasive methods. So we did not put one shovel into the ground to overturn the dirt. That was important to the Pueblo, that we left the sites the same after this research as they were before. And I think really given the tools of modern archaeology, it's surprising how much data we can actually get out of these sites. Don't get me wrong, I would love to excavate them and see what's going on underground, but that's not the Pueblo's wishes, and so of course I respect those. So let's go back to 1681. What happens after the Spaniards are evicted, and between 1681 and 1685, this early part of the revolt period? Well, we know that the first thing that happened is Pope takes a tour of the Pueblos. So he moves all the way around, visits all the Pueblos, gets all the way out to Hopi most likely, and he gives instructions to the Pueblos as he goes around. He tells them famously to smash and burn the images of the Holy Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, the crosses, and everything that have to do with Christianity, to burn the churches and smash the bells, and that in this way they would return to live as they had in ancient times. So there's really two parts to Pope's message here. He's telling them to get rid of the Spanish influence and also revive their earlier practices. And we'll see some of that in the archaeology that I'm going to show you in a minute. Incidentally, the tradition of touring the Pueblo villages was something that was inaugurated by Spanish governors when they came in. So every time a new Spanish governor came into colonial New Mexico, he would make a tour of the Pueblos. Who knows? It's just speculation, but it's interesting that Pope is again drawing on some of the templates that were laid down by the Spaniards in the early years after the revolt here. And as we know from some documents, so Otermin, the governor at the time, actually makes an attempt to reconquer New Mexico in 1681, a very unsuccessful attempt. He comes up to Cochiti and to Santa Fe and makes no inroads at all and turns around and goes right back down to El Paso. And on his way up, he's telling us what he's seeing in the Pueblos south of Albuquerque as he goes through. And he sees that the churches are burned and all the iconography is smashed and just some incredible things. So Pope gives that order. Some of the Pueblos had not destroyed their churches, incidentally. So it was not that right when the revolt went down, everybody did. Some Pueblos did, some Pueblos didn't. So at Santo Domingo, Kiva, for example, they killed the priests, dug a grave in front of the altar, left their body in the grave, but didn't touch anything else in the church. So the church doors were closed, and all the iconography, all the holy books, everything was left intact initially. After Pope makes his tour, they burn the church and destroy stuff. Famously at Zuni in 1692, when Vargas comes back, they still have an altar set up with prayer books and candles and iconography. So there's differential compliance with Pope's orders in different Pueblos. As Mike said, different meanings to different people. And we'll see some of that as I get on to the talk. We know that in Jemez in 1680, they martyred the priest. This is, he was known to be a clairvoyant priest, so he had a special representation. So this is actually an 18th century painting from Mexico of the martyrdom of Fray Juan de Jesus. I love it because he's got an Aztec macana here, that weapon that Mike was talking about a minute ago. Uh-oh. Come back. It'll be back in a second. It's delicate. I hope it will be back. I'm not going to touch it. There we go. All right. Sorry. It's my daughter and her friend. Sorry. We're back. Okay. So at Jemez, they martyr this priest. This guy doesn't look particularly Jemez to me, but in any case, they martyr the priest. They burn the village to the ground. Not just the mission church, but their own homes they burn to the ground. And they migrate 6 miles to the north where they build a new pueblo. Now, why do they burn their own homes to the ground? This was a mission village that was founded by the Spaniards in 1622 and was intended to pull them down from the mesa tops, which they found too hard to minister to. So it's likely that the Jemez didn't think of this as their home. They thought of their ancestral homes up on the mesas here, and so they burn it because they think of this as a Spanish village. This is where Jemez Pueblo is located today, Walatoa, where they end up moving back. So they moved to Patokwa. So this is one of the sites that I've worked on in my research. This is where it's located on the mesa here. Just for a sense of scale, there's a water tower back here. My friend Irma's house is right down here. And so this is a map that we made of the site using surveying instruments. So this is a surface map of the site. What you're seeing here, these are the buried room blocks. So this is the Pueblo, 300 some years after. Someone took a bulldozer through the northern mound in the 1950s because there's rumored to be a golden bell buried at this site. These are persistent rumors in New Mexico about many mission sites. I'm here to tell you today there are not golden bells buried at these sites. The Spaniards were trying to pull gold out. They were not sending gold to. So please don't run any more bulldozers through any of these sites. It makes our work difficult as archaeologists. So this is my reconstruction of what Patokwa probably looked like. And something Mike alluded to that I'll get back to again in a minute is the construction here. You can see these long rooms laid out in this plan, and so we can, when we look at the, you can see many of the walls still above ground, and when we look at the masonry in there, we can look at the patterns of where the walls abut each other or where they bond, and we can see that this whole thing was laid out at one time. And that tells us that the entire community was working together to build this village, and that there was strong leadership. Somebody had to lay out the plan for this village. Now, what happens to Pope? Sometime after 1681, but before 1684, Pope is actually ousted from power. He's ruling in too much of a dictatorial style. This is what we get from Spanish interviews after the revolt, and they say that Pope was ruling in the manner of a Spanish governor. One document actually says that he tried to impose a tax on the Pueblos, right? And this was exactly one of the things that made them so angry about being under Spanish control. So Pope's actually voted out of power, not voted out of power, pushed out of power, and there are two other leaders, one from Picaris, Lee Picaris, and one from Old Cochiti, or San Domingo, who take over as the ruler. But even though Pope goes out of power, his message is still very much influencing what's happening in Pueblo culture at the time. So Patokwa goes up at around 1681, and in 1683, the Jemez built another village just a few miles away on another mesa. We know this because we have tree ring dates out of some of the roof beams that were recovered from the site, and they show that the cutting dates are 1683. So it's pretty clear this village gets built in 1683, and probably sometime between 1683 and 1685, Old Cochiti is completed. This is the village that Mike was talking about a minute ago that he did his dissertation work on and that our advisor, Bob Purcell, worked on. Now, you see all three of these villages are very similar in their architecture. They all have two plazas and two kivas. And this is not a common pattern. We don't see this going on in lots of pueblos before the revolt period. So there's something happening here that they're emphasizing duality. They're emphasizing two plazas, two kivas in each one. I think what they're emphasizing is the traditional moedal social organization. So when you go to many of the pueblos today to their feast days and you see people dancing, often one side will dance first. Sometimes it's at Jemez it's the pumpkin and the turquoise. Sometimes it's the north and the south. At Zia it's the turquoise and the wren or the raven. So I think what's going on is Pope is telling them, go back to the ways of your ancestors. And that's being interpreted as going back to traditional Pueblo social organization, which emphasizes balance, it emphasizes duality, it emphasizes the two sides. So we see that happening in this architecture of this early period. Interestingly, when I look at the archaeology of Jemez prior to the revolt period, I don't see any emphasis on duality. It doesn't seem that moieties are actually that important to Jemez before the revolt period. So I think what's actually going on, but they are important up here in the northern Tiwa, and especially among the Tewa Pueblos. And of course, Pope was from Okeowenge. So I think it's likely that this is really coming down from Pope. This is what Pope thinks traditional Pueblo social organization is. It's supposed to emphasize the duality. And I have to admit, this is not entirely my own interpretation. This was suggested to me by the folks at Jemez when I presented this to them, because they said, oh yeah, we have this, our oral traditions tell us that we didn't always have two sides and that one of the sides came in later. And we know that at Bullets Aqua there were people from Kiva living, Santo Domingo, living side by side with the Jemez there. So the guys that I work with at Jemez said, oh, I wonder if that's one of the places where they invented this. Also, Patokwa means turquoise moiety place. So Bullets Aqua means Pueblo the abalone shell. But, all right. Another way we see this enacted in the archaeology of the period is we see a revival of traditional ceramic design. So we see motifs, this double-headed key motif, which was popular in the 1500s, goes out of use largely in the 1600s, and after the revolt we see it popping up on the pottery that we find at lots of these pueblos. So you see it right up here, you see it up here, it's very, very common. Also a feather motif, similar thing happens with the feather motif. And I guess we shouldn't be that surprised. This is what Pope told people to do, right? To go back to the ways of the ancestors. So we see that happening in the ceramics. But the reason we do the archaeology is to find the differences between what we're told happened by the documents and what actually happened on the ground. And so one of the best examples of this comes from Jemez, where before the revolt, Jemez is really famous for making this black on white pottery that we creatively call Jemez black on white. For about 300 years before the revolt, the dominant decorated pottery at Jemez is Jemez black on white. So when I went out to these sites to study what happened to their pottery afterwards, I expected to see a resumption of Jemez black on white, a return to traditional design elements. So I was shocked when we did the analysis out there, and we found that in fact the opposite happens. They stop making black on white after the revolt, and they start making an entirely new type of pottery, this redware. Why does this happen? Well, I think two things are going on. Number one, this redware is produced at pueblos all across from Pecos in the east all the way over to Jemez in the west. And so this is part of what I mentioned before, Pope mobilizing this notion of a pan-Pueblo ethnic identity. And you're seeing that in the pottery. Jemez is no longer making the pottery that only the Jemez people make. Jemez starts making the pottery that all their neighbors are making. There's also a ton of migration between these groups at this time, people moving from one pueblo to another. So certainly there's lots of movement back and forth between and people learning new pottery styles from them. But maybe even more importantly, we know from the archaeology of the church that Mike showed you at Gisua that in the early 1600s, the Franciscans there are forcing the Jemez women to make ecclesiastical forms of Jemez black on white. So we have this chalice, we have a crucifix, we have candlestick holders, we have lots of soup plates with Spanish forms. And so the Jemez oral tradition about this is that the black and white style was seen as a tainted style. And so rather than returning to it as a pottery of their ancestors, they saw this as tainted by the Spaniards. So it's actually more about Pope's rejection of all things Spanish, which is why they stopped making the black on white. So anyway, this is something that archaeology shows us that you just don't get in the documents. If you read the documents, you'd think it was go back to the old ways and get rid of the Spanish stuff, and we just don't see that in quite that neat way on the ground. Probably the best example of this comes from Bandelier National Monument. We're in a cavate that's occupied there. During the late 1680s, we have this image inscribed in the plaster of the cavate. I'm assuming many of you have been to Bandelier and know what I mean. Cavates, these little cave rooms that were dug in the cliffs at Bandelier. And so this image looks very European when you first see it, right? It's got very European style eyes. Seems very influenced by 17th century iconography of the Virgin or of Saints of Santa Rosa de Lima, especially with the halo around the head and then maybe this veil that you see around the face there. But it clearly has Pueblo characteristics as well. So the mouth is the kind of mouth we see typically depicted on Kachina imagery, right? And also, while the halo may be something associated with Spanish colonial art, there is a tradition in Pueblo iconography of having similar halos. So this is from a Sun Kachina depiction around Cochiti Reservoir. Now, we could look at this as the persistence of Spanish and Catholic influence through the revolt period. So even though Pope told them to get rid of the Catholic stuff, we still see some Catholic stuff being produced. And you could interpret it as some kind of underground Catholicism being practiced in private. I don't support that interpretation, and that's because this image is not surrounded by images of a crucifix or of fish or other traditional Christian images. It's surrounded entirely by very traditional Puebloan images of kachinas, of a koshare here, all these mass images. It's as though they're taking the Virgin and bringing her into the Pueblo pantheon. So I call this the Virgin Kachina. They're taking the power of the Catholic imagery and bringing it into the Pueblo world. So while when you read the histories and it says, Pope says, kick out all the Spanish stuff, it's just a lot more interesting on the ground about the creative ways that people sometimes appropriated the tools of Spanish colonizers for their own means and uses. I'm pretty sure it was women doing this because this image is actually directly in front of 2 corn mealing bins. So women who were kneeling on the ground would have looked up and saw these images as they were grinding their corn here. So this gets us to 1686 to 1691, the latter half of this period. What happens then? Well, the most significant events were a couple of attempted reconquests that we hear very little about, but there are 2 very, very brief references, and I'm talking about a sentence or 2 that tell us that in 1687 and in 1689 there were attempts by the Spaniards to come up from El Paso del Norte and reconquer the Pueblos. The first one, 1687, they attacked Santa Ana Pueblo, which at that time was the southernmost Pueblo, so kind of the first one they hit going up the Rio Grande. And in 1689 they attacked Zia Pueblo. Now, the battle at Zia, according to Spanish accounts, was large. Those accounts actually have stunning similarities to accounts of the famous battle at Acoma in 1601, so I'm a little dubious that we're reading actual numbers, but they say they killed 600 Zias there. What we do know is that they kill 4 very important Zia leaders in that battle. And maybe even more importantly, they capture a war captain on the battlefield, a man named Bartolome de Ojeda. And Ojeda goes south. He's taken south with the Spaniards into El Paso del Norte, where I say he becomes a 17th century victim of the Stockholm Syndrome, because he's going to come back with the Spaniards in 1692, and he is the Spaniards' best weapon in the reconquest. Vargas gets a lot of credit. Vargas could not have done what he did without this man, who was literate, who wrote letters back and forth to Vargas as he's out among the Pueblos. And so he would go into Pueblos, often without Vargas there, and tell them Vargas is coming back and we need to ally with them. So Zia, this is Zia Pueblo. You got Patokwa up here, the Jemez Revolt period site. Bolitzakwa up here, the other one, and this is Old Cochiti. Zia's burned that day in 1689, and the people leave and build another new pueblo in 1689 called Cerro Colorado, directly west of modern-day Jemez Pueblo, Walatoa. You can see it in the distance as you drive by on Highway 4. And they are joined there by people from Santa Ana. So there they built this new pueblo in 1689, and this is the reconstruction of that one. And so you can see it looks a little bit different. It has some similarities. There is communal construction going on, so it's not every family building their own. People are cooperating in this construction. But you see it's different from the 3 that were built in those first 5 years of the revolt period. So they're no longer doing this dual plaza thing. I mean, there are kind of 2 plazas, but there's also space down here. But more importantly, there are no subterranean circular kivas at that site. So we're starting to see the shift here where Pope's message about revivalism, about going back to the old ways, is not affecting the architecture in the same ways 9 years later that it did in those first couple of years after the revolt. Why is that happening? Well, if we read the documents, it says there's inter-Pueblo warfare going on. This is what Ojeda tells them when he goes south. He says, look, the Carries are fighting with the Tewas, and the Jemez are fighting with the Carries, and everybody's fighting with Taos. They actually all say Taos are the troublemakers. So for many years, that's been the explanation for why Vargas succeeds in 1692, where Otermin failed in 1680. Right? Everybody wants to know why were the Spaniards successful in 1692. So, and this explanation goes some of the way, but there are some problems with it too. Now, we see through the pottery that this is partially true. So, for example, we see at Zia Pueblo, prior to the revolt, that they had pretty robust trade with the Tawas. So we find lots of Tawa pottery at Zia Pueblo before the revolt. At their site in 1689, there was no Tawa pottery at all. So it's clear that something happens between 1680 and 1689 that ruptures their relationship. So the Zia are no longer trading partners with the Tawas. At Jemez, the exact opposite happens. Prior to the revolt, there is almost no Tawa pottery found at ancestral Jemez sites. And in fact, when Benavides writes his memorial in 1630, he talks about a Jemez captain who has he's very proud to show a necklace of ears that he says come from Tawa men that he has killed in battle. And there's been many archaeological studies that show there's no stylistic affinities, there's just no trade going on between the Tawas and the Jemez before the revolt. After the revolt, the opposite. Tawa wares shoot through the roof. We find almost as many Tawa wares at these sites as we do locally made Jemez wares in some cases. So while these guys over here, the Zias and Santa Anas, are not getting along with the Tawas, it's clear that the Jemez are getting along with Tawas, as are the people up at Old Cochiti, where we also find a ton of Tawa pottery. So there kind of end up being three different strongholds that appear to be still allied with each other at the end of the revolt period, and other people, for whatever reason, don't seem to be in that same coalition. So there's still a core that is anti-Spanish and enacting the tenets that Pope laid down, but it's not universal in the same way. Now I'm drifting out of my lost decade here into the years of the Reconquista, but archaeology still has a lot to tell us about those years too, because while we have documents as Vargas goes around to visit the various pueblos, we also have archaeology that tells us a little bit of a different story about what's going on in those communities. Any chance I have to show Diego Romero's pottery here, I do. So this is a great pot. It's actually on display in the British Museum. So right down the hall from the Rosetta Stone, you can see this pot that shows Vargas. It says 1692, Don Diego de Vargas, the most feared of all the ruthless invaders, plots the righteous conquest and colonization of the Pueblo Indians. And the thing I love about this is that it's archaeologically accurate. He's got a Mesa Top Pueblo built in the background, probably because he knows Old Cochiti, and that's probably what's in his mind as he made this pot. Now at Jemez, they're at Patocua and Bolitzacua. Vargas comes back, visits those two pueblos, gives us great descriptions of them. We're sure that is where he tells us how far he's traveling to get there. Everything lines up that we know he visits these sites. But in 1680, he tells the Jemez, move back down to your old village. The Jemez kind of keeps saying, oh yeah, we'll get to it, but our crop isn't so good this year, and I've got a backache, and I can't quite get there. He comes back in 1693, same thing. And sometime between that visit in 1693 and early 1694, they decide to leave these villages, and they build a new Mesa Top Pueblo called Astialacqua on top of a very high defensible mesa in this region. I've done a lot of work up here. It's up on top of this mesa, and you have to be a young, dumb graduate student to sign on to do a project up there. And so after I finished hiking up this thing, I estimate that I spent more time up here than the people who actually live there. That's no joke. We know that they build this site within an 8-month period, and I've hiked this mesa more than 300 times now. And so after this, I vow that my next archaeological project will be somewhere where I can drive a car right up to the site. But you can see what a fantastic site it is. The preservation is absolutely magnificent. We still have walls up there standing, a meter high or more many times. So it was a relatively easy site to map. And this is the map that we get. Now, in our analysis of this village, we can see that this village was never completed. So there were rooms that were still under construction. We can see the masonry piles that are still there of unshaped masonry next to rooms that appear to have only a basal course laid down. And that's because this is where the Jemez are living in 1694 when they're attacked by the Spaniards. I'll give you the details of that battle in a minute. But you can see how very, very different this site is from these two. So it's people leaving these two sites that move here and build this site. So you can see the architecture tells us a totally different story. While we had communal construction at these sites, this is every family building their own little room. This strong centralized leadership, somebody has to be the architect and lay out the plan. There are right angles on all the plazas. Here, it's the local topography is defining how it's built. So you see a breakdown in centralized leadership late in the revolt period, and a breakdown in this ethos of revivalism. They don't feel the need to go back to the ways of the ancestors anymore. Incidentally, there are archaeologists who specialize in the archaeology of warfare, and they have pointed to these villages as the prototypical defensive village that you would build if you're expecting to have a battle. Because you can wall up the corners, pull up the ladders, they had rooftop entryways in many cases, and essentially have an impregnable fortress. So it's interesting that when the Jemez expected that Vargas was coming back, he was in fact making announcements in Santa Fe that he was going to march on the Jemez if they didn't come down. When they're expecting battle, this is the plan that they go to. Now clearly they rely on that mesa for the defense, the geography of the place. But nonetheless, interesting that when they knew a battle was coming, this is what ends up being built. So on July 24, 1694, the eve before the feast of Santiago, incidentally, there is a battle in which Vargas comes up with his forces. This is where Patokwa is located, the first village that they built. And Vargas comes up there, and he has with him, crucially, 100 allies from Zia and Santa Ana, including Bartolome de Ojeda, that guy who went south. When Ojeda comes back with Vargas in 1692, he convinces the Zias and Santa Anas to ally themselves with the Spaniards and not with the Pueblos. And we can see why they would. They seem to already have been in tension with at least the Tewas, if not with the Jemez at that time, right? So they flip allegiances, and they provide 100 soldiers that march on the Jemez Pueblo. And it's really crucial because this is the main trail that you still hike up to get up here, and this is where Vargas's soldiers came up. He stood down here and watched what's going on. His soldiers came up here. It appears that they actually couldn't get through because the trail is so steep, it's easily defendable. You can stand with one person on the top and keep them at bay. But crucially, Ojeda and the warriors from Zia and Santa Ana go around to the north end of the Pueblo. This is actually looking south here. This is Sandia Peak down here. And they attack from the back. And so they show the other Spaniards a trail that goes up the other side that they knew about because they knew the area. So without Ojeda and those allies, it never would have happened. Just like Mike said with Coronado, had it not been for the 1,000 indigenous allies that he had with him, things would not have happened the same way. Same thing happens. And this is a recurring pattern that we don't hear enough about, is the role of other indigenous peoples in many of these events. Now we still find remnants of this battle up there. There are defensive walls all over the place on both the north and south ends of the mesa. This is a part that looks directly down on that trail coming up, where they've drilled holes in the rock so you can lay on the ground, look through there, and keep track of anybody coming up the trail. And then these are sling stones that they brought up there. The tuff up here is very friable, right? This is volcanic tuff, just like over in Bandelier. And that breaks apart if you throw it against anything hard. It's just not a hard enough stone. So they bring up river cobbles from the river, and this is a pile of ammunition that they used in their sling stones that they're throwing down at the Spaniards. And there are 3 piles that are still there today. You can still see them sitting there, remnants of that battle. And of course, we find houses that are burned in the battle. We find Spanish chainmail. By the end of the day, 87 Jemez warriors were killed, which includes 5 burned alive in their houses. About 360 Jemez women, children, and elderly were taken prisoner and brought back down to Patokwa. Now the Jemez have a legend about this, where they say that at a certain point in the battle, when things started going south, the warriors started jumping off the cliffs, and that 7 warriors jumped and fell to their deaths. And then after that, there was an apparition of a saint, either San Diego or in some versions it's the Virgin Mary. And they appear and give the Pueblo warriors power to jump off the edge of the mesa. And the phrase they use is they were able to float like butterflies into the valley below and survive from this battle. So a couple of interesting things. First of all, they're appropriating again the power of a Spanish saint that was often used in battle. So both Santiago and the Virgin were used in battle. So Vargas is marching with the banner of La Conquistadora as he's marching. And so the Pueblos are kind of appropriating that from the Spaniards and using it for their own devices. Now that legend sounds a little bit crazy when you see that mesa and see that we have 200-foot cliffs there, and how could anybody survive? And so for many years I thought that's a nice story, but I'll believe it when I see it, when someone jumps off here. But in the documents they actually tell of a man 3 days after the battle. The Spaniards are cleaning the corn out of the rooms up there, and a man crawls up out of the rocks on the southern end of the mesa, and his shoulder is all chewed up and his thigh is all ripped open. He's dying of thirst, so he begs them for water. They give him water, they interrogate him, then they execute him. But this appears to be a man who jumped off those cliffs. That's how he injures his shoulder and his leg. Some way he survives that landing, manages to live in the rocks for 3 days before crawling back up to the top. So that legend no longer sounds so fanciful to me, and I'm sure that there were many Jemez warriors who jumped off those cliffs and managed to survive. I should have showed you this slide, because these are the cliffs that they would have been jumping on. I have stood at the edge of these many, many times and looked over the edge and thought, how would I find a safe landing down there? And I'm still in awe that it could be done. But we know that at least 60 Jemez warriors survived the battle because they come back and parley with Vargas in the days after. So Vargas brings the women and children down and puts them back into Patokwa. They later build a small church in the corner. Very, very different architecture of that church than the one that you saw that Mike showed before. So that the 1620s church is massive. The Franciscans are a little reluctant to build such a giant church, right? So this shows the shift that the revolt brings about in Franciscan evangelical policy. I'm not going to say that they were entirely enlightened, but there was a kinder, gentler Franciscan evangelism after the revolt than there was before the revolt, I would say. But importantly, it's when Vargas is holed up here that these Jemez warriors come back. They are trying to bargain for the release of their wives and children, and Vargas eventually says, okay, I will release the women and children if you promise to give me 50 warriors, because I need to go march on Black Mesa on the Tewas, on the last Pueblo Revolt stronghold. And so the Jemez feel they have no choice but to agree to do that. They're going to have to march on their allies throughout this whole period. And Vargas, I'm still not sure whether he had a sense of irony or whether this is coincidence, but the way Vargas signals to the Jemez about the day that they're supposed to go to Black Mesa is he sends a knotted cord that they have to untie to go meet him at Black Mesa to march on Black Mesa, the final Pueblo Revolt stronghold. So, since Mike started with a shot of his book, a shot of mine in the end, you can read more about this in here. This seems like shameless self-promotion, except that all the proceeds from this book are donated to, the author's proceeds are donated to the Pueblo of Jemez. So I don't get a cent out of this book. It all goes back to the Pueblo. So you can order it online, Amazon, University of Arizona Press, all your usual places. And then I always love to end with this slide. So many of you will recognize this as the Pope statue that was installed in the National Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building in 2005, right? Every state gets 2 slots, and New Mexico had the last open slot. Pope was installed there. It so happens that when they installed it for the unveiling in the Statuary Hall, they happened to put it directly in front of this massive painting. You may recognize this guy in the back. This is Christopher Columbus. And so I always like to say, but Pope has his back to Columbus, and he's got his eyes on the future here. So, but ironic where they did. Thank you so much for listening.